So we're up to a new book, huh?
Pretty exciting, right? That's the part of what we're going to talk about today, what it means to be up to a new book.
I'm ready.
I'm touched that all you guys showed up with primetime TV going on now at 7 o'clock. We're competing with election results, but
You're not gonna it's not going to happen for a few days.
Yeah, it'll be a few days, I think.
We learned our lesson.
Maybe Shemot
Yeah.
What's the lesson we learned?
I am watching it. I have it on, but nothing's going on.
Nothing.
Margie,
I don't know what the lesson that we learned.
Oh, the lesson that we learned is not to expect results on election night. Don't watch
Exactly.
Right, that doesn't happen anymore.
yeah.
It doesn't seem to happen, period. But yeah.
No. I mean, democracy might be over tomorrow, so let's enjoy some.
See?
It won't be over.
It's not going to be over.
Is that called wishful thinking, hopeful thinking, maybe thinking, possibly thinking?
Hello, Paul.
Hi.
All right, I'm going to pull up the source sheet. We'll still give everybody like a minute or so. But we've been running out of time, not having extra time so far in our program.
Right.
It's better to start sooner than later.
Pyramids and towers.
Hopefully the title will make sense by the end, but I don't want to give away too much before we get there. But what I do want to discuss today is really part of how we left off last week in the last Parshat, and really touching on what Jeff just mentioned before. The exciting part about the Parshat this week, about us starting Sefer Shemot, is it's our first time starting a new book of Torah. We did Borashia together, and I'll admit we actually missed starting Borashia together because I wasn't ready in time for Borashia, so we started a couple weeks late. But we did Borashia together, but now we're finally up to a new book of the Torah, the second book of the Torah. And getting up to a new book of the Torah, finishing Borashia and moving on to Shemot, finishing Genesis, moving on to Exodus, that inherently should raise the question of how do these books relate to each other? How does Shemot relate back to Borashia? Are we just continuing the story? Are there different themes, competing themes? Are there multiple perspectives God's trying to emphasize or put into play? How does the book of Shemot relate back to the book of Genesis? That's the opening question I want to discuss a little bit together. I want to look at together. So to that end, I think one of the easiest ways, one of the most effective ways to get a sense of how these two sections interact with each other, to see what note, what tone, what self-conception the book of Exodus, Sefer Shemot has, is to look at how it begins, look at how Shemot begins and how it's situating itself. So if we look in the first source, we have the very beginning of Shemot, the first few verses, the first few psukim of the book of Exodus. And this is where we'll spend a lot of our time tonight focusing on, although not exclusively. The Torah tells us, Ve'ele Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma, and these are the names of the children of Israel coming to Egypt. Eit Yaakov, with Jacob, Ish uveto ba'u, man and his household came. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, V'Asher. All of these kids, all right, we get them all. Vayhi kol nefesh, yotei yerech Yaakov shivim nefesh, and all of the descendants of Yaakov's loins were 70. The Yosef hayab b'Mitzrayim, and Joseph was already in Egypt. The Yamot Yosef v'chol achav v'chol hador hahu, and Joseph died, and his brothers, and that entire generation. That's how the story begins. That's how Shemot begins. So before we even jump into it, just right off the bat, looking at this first section, this first little aliyah, Parshiah, what does one think of when one looks at this as our introduction to Exodus, as our introduction to the book of Shemot? Is it strange? Does it make sense? What do we notice about this opening Parshiah? Opening the floor to anybody's comments, questions, etc.
Continuation. These are the families. These are the to me, this is just a kid. How'd they get there? They were already in, actually, these guys were already there. When did they get to Egypt? In the beginning of Shemot, or did they get there a little earlier?
Perfect. So Lindy's pointing out that when we look at this little opening, right, we have, these are the names of the children of Israel who went down to Egypt, but we don't have any context explaining what's going on. When did they get to Egypt? Who are these people? Why do we care? In other words, just on a very basic level, clearly the story is already dependent on Bereshit, on Genesis.
Right.
There's an assumption that you already have background facts, familiarity with the characters, and you already have a sense of what's going on. Yeah, Paul, please.
So, I mean, what we're recognizing here is that a family is soon to become a nation.
Hmm.
And it seems to me that there's a real, I mean, it's a very powerful concept.
Can you say more? How do you see that in the text? Because that's one of the things we're going to try and discuss a little bit.
In other words, this family, which was the focus of Sefer Bereshit, goes to a place called Mitzrayim, and in Mitzrayim, they become a nation. And not coincidentally, their first national experience is what? Shibud. And that notion of slavery, that notion of affliction, seems to be inextricably connected to the mission of this tribe, of this nation.
And how do you see that expressed in the opening parsha? Because of the focus on the names of the nation, it's like trying to spell out the nation, or
well, it's the names of the family, but it's also the names of the tribes, and the tribe becomes a nation.
In other words, really, what Paul is pointing out is that one perspective is why is it that Shemot opens with this sort of enigmatic list of Jacob's children? So Lindy pointed out part of it is harkening back to the previous section. It's telling us the previously existing characters we've just been reading about. Now they're in Egypt. But Paul's pointing out there's more than that. It's not just giving us an update or situating us or giving us some context, but by opening up with this list of names, we're setting the tone for what's about to come. These are the 12 tribes, and now that we have tribes, we're ready to actually have a story of a nation and to begin talking about what the nation has, what it entails, how it was formed, etc. So maybe
Can
it also go back to Bereshit, because it started out with, if you go back to Abraham and Sarah, they were promised they would become nations. From them, they would become nations. They would become a people. They would become big. And I mean, then it went and it kept narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. You know, now we're down to Jacob and and down to Joseph, and here we are. I mean, they went from 2 to how many? Down to 70, who will then grow.
Excellent.
It's a beginning of an answer to what started with Abraham and Sarah.
Perfect.
And there's a clean break. All of the people of that generation die. It emphasizes that.
That's true.
It's like a wall almost, or a new beginning.
Perfect. I think Lindy and Joel are pointing out two of the sort of opposing tensions that are really being expressed here that we were just pointing out and discussing a little bit through Paul's comments. That on the one hand, we're sort of past focused, that we're raising these families that we've already mentioned, we already know about, you have to have read information already to know, and we're hearkening back to the past. Like Lindy said, we're hearkening back to the promise to Abraham that we're now fulfilling, to the promise of nationhood, that really this is a fulfillment of things that lay in the past. But at the same time, as Joel points out, there's also the death of the old generation and the conclusion of the story of the patriarchs, the conclusion of the first family's time in the spotlight, and now a new generation is arising. Inherent to the transition is both hearkening back to the origins that led to the nation, but also now something new, something different, that they're becoming a nation. Yeah, Lindy, for sure.
Okay, so if you go back to the past, now we're in Egypt, right?
Yeah.
And Joseph died. What was the I hate to say promise. What was the promise? If the covenant of the parts wasn't exactly a promise, the warning, I guess you would say, the dream, the way, because I don't see it as a promise, because when you think promise, you think usually good, but that's not good. But it's the beginning of what the prophecy that God gave Abraham, for the lack of a better word. Your people are going to be, exiled for all these years, or 430 or however many. Yeah. So Joseph dies, the tribes are there. We haven't gotten past the first, but it's the beginning of the remembrance of who these people were going away, and that are beginning into their
for sure. I think that's a great call too. The part of it is situating within the larger historical narrative of Abraham's promise, that Egypt is an essential part of that promise. And what we're doing here is continuing and actualizing that. Yeah, Jeff, that's how you raised your hand.
I think if you look at just these 6 psukim, you may think that this is the end of a nation, that there's no hope here that there is going to be a nation.
Excellent.
We need to move on, to go on to Pasuk 7 and 8 to understand what is happening, just from this alone.
Excellent. I think that's a great point. Jeff's really pointing out that, and one of the things we try to do a lot methodologically in this year, is that if you take a fresh set of eyes a fresh perspective on this Parsha. So we just read the story of Joseph and Jacob and his brothers, and there's this great story. And what's the first thing we read? All of them died. Sounds like the story's almost over. It almost sounds like a conclusion of the previous story. The nation didn't work. Maybe it completely failed. Eventually, we find out, and the Jews are in Egypt still, but they're slaves. So now one's still wondering, well, is the story over? Did they just fail? Is slavery just the end of the story? So from the fresh perspective of a new reader, on the one hand, we're continuing the story of Yosef, like we've been saying. But as Jeff points out, this definitive Pasuk 6, Joseph and all his brothers and the whole generation died, that's also sort of pushing us away from the past, away from the previous story, and almost intimating to us that something new is about to happen, something that breaks from the previous truth, that breaks from the future I've been reading so far. So this whole question of how are we going to relate to Shemot, how are we going to relate to Exodus? It's not just theoretical, of course. It impacts our methodology, our context, our perspective, how we read the stories. But beyond that, it also has a lot of literature surrounding it in the rabbinic realm, because the rabbis have discussed the various halakhic implications of how you codify and determine and categorize the various books of the Torah. So there's all different kinds of discussions about them. One of the famous ones is Megillah Nitnes or Sefer Nitnes, which is a machloket, a debate about whether or not the Torah can be written by individual books, or whether it has to be the whole Torah is written together, the whole Tanakh is written together, certain sections are written together, because there's some sort of halakhic significance to what's a book, what's a standalone unit of Torah, and what's a rider, what's a sequel, what's contingent on others. So there is that idea. But beyond that, we also see in the midrashic level and the explanatory level, the rabbis sort of struggle with the codification and classification of the book of the Torah in terms of how they name them. We know the Torah has the 5 books of Moses, the names that we're all familiar with. See them in English, which is perhaps Greek influence, English, the Latin, the Greek. See them in Hebrew, Bereshit, Shemot, Sefer, etc. But the rabbis actually had their own names for the Torah, for the book of the Torah. And those names were supposed to express both the content, themes, and messages in the various books, and perhaps even some of the halachic significance or larger tradition significance of these books.
Rabbi, could you ask everyone to just mute?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, everybody, please feel free to mute. And Jeff or whoever has the host ID, feel free to take hostship to mute others if you want to.
Okay.
Yeah, as always, please feel free to mute. Stay muted until you have something to say, and then just speak up. No need to raise your hand. Just unmute yourself. In the meantime, if everyone could please mute their mics, that'd be very, very useful. Thank you all so much. So what we have now is this idea that the rabbis in their discussion about what to call the book of Exodus, how to refer to it, what themes to focus on, they're also touching upon this idea that the book of Exodus is this interesting transitionary period. Our first sequel, the second book in the Bible, and it's not exactly clear how to relate to it. So to that end, again, just a reminder to everybody to please mute. To that end, we'll now look at some of the rabbinic sources, some of the commentaries or Talmudic discussion about how to relate to this book. How does it relate back to Genesis, to the first book? Is it a continuation? Is it something new? And how does that express itself? So in source 2, we have the commentary of the Hamak Davar, the Netziv, Rabbi Natali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, living in the 19th century, late 1800s, early 1900s. In his commentary on the Torah, he opens every book of the Torah by tackling this question. What is the rabbinic name of this book? And what does that tell us about what's inside and how it relates to the larger corpus of Torah? So in discussing Shemot and discussing Exodus, the Netziv says as follows: Zeh HaSefer Nikra B'fi Baalei HaMidrash Sefer Shemot. So some of the authors of Midrash, some of the rabbis have called this the book of names, the book of Shemot. Kidei Ita B'Bereshit Rama Perek Gimel Vayior Neged Shishim Shemot, etc. Like it mentioned somewhere in Borashia Rabbah. Somewhere in Borashia Rabbah, there's a reference that the second book of the Torah should be called Shemot. Great. B'chein B'harbi Makomot, and so too in many places. B'haramban Sofa Sefer Karu Sefer Geula. Ramban, though, says this isn't the book of names, it's not the book of Shemot, rather it's the book of Geula, the book of redemption. So already we see this interesting difference between the Ramban and the Midrash, the other earlier Talmudic rabbis. The Ramban is conceptualizing this book, the book of Exodus, as a book of Geula, a book about redemption, whereas the rabbis are conceptualizing it as a book about Shemot, about names. I think that already expresses such different perspectives. If this is the book of Shemot, the book of names, then what we're doing here is we're seeing the actualization, the culmination of the genealogies, the national history, the national story that was all set up in Bereshit. It gets actualized in the book of names, where we have the lists of the nationhood, of the members of the nation. We have the names of the people who led it. We have various lists on how to build the temple, how to undergo communal service. It's a book of a practical handout, a practical guide of who was important, how did they do it, how did the Jewish people make their nation. That's the book of names that's focused on the people, on the names, on the individuals who matter and comprise the nation. But the book of Geula, the book of redemption, obviously, is much more focused on the historical narrative, on the theological, on the relationship to God, on the question of Jewish redemption, of religious redemption and spiritual redemption, and perhaps best articulated, the culmination of the book of Geula, the peak of the book of Geula, of the book of Exodus, one could perhaps call it, or of redemption, would presumably be the redemption or the Exodus from Egypt. That would be the climax. The second book of the Torah climaxes with the Jewish people being redeemed from Egypt. Whereas if what we're dealing with is not Sefer Geula, but rather Sefer Shemot, it's about the Jewish people becoming a nation, then the culmination isn't the Exodus from Egypt, but rather that's just the necessary step to really explore the character depth of what it takes to become a nation, what it takes to become a leader, what it takes to become a Baal Shem, a significant person, a leader, someone who stands for God and God's mission. So already we see this sort of difference in the different names, how they can emphasize or highlight different elements of what's going on here. But beyond that, the Hamik David the Tzid continues and quotes an even more out there, more interesting perspective of the Bahag. Zulat Rabbeinu Bahag, the Be'er Halachot Gedolot, one of the earliest compendiums of mitzvot, an early Gaonic work, the Bahag, he writes in his book, the Sof Sikfro HaKodesh, the end of his holy book, Yikra'uhu Sefer Sheni. What's the name of Shemot? What's the name of Exodus, according to the Bahag? The second book. Sefer Sheni, the second book. Tekachashav Chamisha Chumshei Torah. Sefer Bereshit, the Chumash Sheni, the Sefer Kohanim, Pekudim, and Mishnah Torah. According to the Bahag, there's 5 books of the Torah. There's Bereshit, Sheni, Kohanim, Pekudim, and Mishnah Torah. The second book of the Torah is just called number 2. In other words, according to the Bahag, what's extremely clear? How does the Bahag relate to Sefer Shemot? What does the Bahag think of Sefer Shemot? It's just a sequel to Bereshit. It's book number 2. It doesn't have its own name. It doesn't have its own identity. It's just continuing the first book. And of course, what are some good indications of evidence for this theory? That Sefer Shemot is really just a continuation of the previous book. Anyone have any ideas of evidence why one might think that? So I'll give one very basic one from a narrative perspective. We have the narrative being furthered. We have references to Yosef. We have a continuation of the Yosef story.
First battle.
For sure. Even more basic, we have narrative. If we look in Vayikra, if we look in Leviticus, we lose narrative for most of the book. We now have more of a law focus. But Shemot, much like Bereshit, is unique in that it actually has this tone of telling over a story, telling over an origin tale. So the tone, the narrative, the perspective is very similar between the two stories. The characters are referenced again, and they're very similar between the two stories. It makes a lot of sense to connect them. But what is the strongest argument? What is the strongest proof that the book of Shemot is really a continuation of Bereshit? Anybody know off the top of their heads? What's the best evidence we have that Shemot's a continuation of Bereshit? I'll scroll up to the beginning of Shemot and feel free.
The Va.
Perfect, Jeff sees it. The Vav. The very beginning of Shemot, we open up by saying what? Ve'ela Shemot b'nei Israel. And these are the names of the children of Israel. The Vav is a conjunctive in Hebrew. So by adding a Vav in the beginning of the first word of the first verse, and these are the names, which interestingly, you'll note Sefaria doesn't translate. Sefaria just says these, it doesn't say and these. I'm sure Robert Alter has what to say about that in his book. But you'll note that it's a conjunctive. It continues, it combines two things. So it seems to be saying that Shemot is really a continuation of the previous book. It's Sefer Sheni, like we saw the Sefer, like the Bahag said. And that's why it starts with a Vav. That's why it starts with and to the conjunctive. And in fact, if you look in the Ibn Ezra, if you look on the Ibn Ezra's commentary, medieval commentary on Torah, on Sefer Shemot, he says, Tam Havav, Ba'avor Shehizkir B'sofa Sefer Rishon, etc., etc. What's the reason of the Vav? Because the story is picking up where the last book left off. The last book left off with Yosef and his descendants, and this book's picking up with what happened after Yosef dies. So says Ibn Ezra, the Vav indicates to us that we have a connection, we have a conjunctive, and therefore what we're dealing with here is really the culmination or the continuation of the previous story. So far what we've seen is that we're about to start a new book. We're about to start the book of Shemot, and the rabbis have all different types of names that perhaps express different perspectives on what's going on and what we're accomplishing in Shemot. One perspective we saw was that Shemot is Sefer Sheni, the second book, merely a continuation of Bereshit, the narrative sequel that concludes the narrative parts of the story and transitions on to the end. That was held by the Bahag, and perhaps put forth by the Ibn Ezra, who, commenting on the Vav, on the conjunctive to open up Exodus, notes that we're really continuing a previous story, and the names, not just the names. So far, so good. That's the position of the Bahag, maybe the Ibn Ezra, some of the earlier rabbinic authorities, some of the Pashtanim, the simple perspective. But the Ramban, the Nachmanides, in his lengthy commentary on the Torah, goes in a totally different route, totally different avenue, different perspective. Clearly, just to note, the literature, the ink being spilt over what's the proper nickname for the second book of the Torah. Very interesting. Clearly, we're not just arguing about some sort of trivial nickname convention here, but we're talking about what is the heart of the matter. What is going on? What is the nature of the second book of the Torah? And that's why every Rishon, every rabbi, every commentary, they have their opinion, they have to stick to, they have their own insight on what we should call it. So the Ramban feels strongly that what we've read so far, the Bahag's approach, the earlier approach, is totally wrong. Says the Ramban in source number 4. The Ramban chimes in on this argument of how to refer, how to nickname the second book of the Torah, and he says, Tam ve'eleh Shemot. The reason that it says, and these are the names, is because, being that this is Sefer Geula, the book of redemption, as we mentioned before, the Ramban views this as the book of redemption. So since this is the book of redemption, and the point of it is about how the Jews were redeemed from Egypt, the Torah wants to open up by recounting the descent into Egypt. So says the Ramban, it's true that the Vav, is hearkening back to Bereshit, is referencing a previous book, but it's not doing that because Shemot is just a continuation of what happened before, but rather it's because it's establishing that previous event, the descent to Egypt, is actually the beginning of our new story, the story of Geula, the story of redemption. So says Ramban, we're dealing with a totally separate thing here. Ki az galu barush golim, that's when they are exiled, kasher pirashti, like I explained, lefichach yachzor tchilat ha'inyan. Therefore, it has to go back to the very beginning of the matter. Skipping a little bit now in the Ramban, see now Ke'inyan in the bold. Ke'inyan hazeh b'sefer Divrei Yamim b'sefer Ezra. And this is no different from the books of Ezra or the books of Chronicles. They continue the stories that were laid out in the book of Kings. They continue the stories that are laid out in the book of Samuel, the book of Judges. But they're not a continuation of the same book. They're a new book. We know throughout Nevi'im, throughout Ketuvim, throughout Tanakh, the story has one overarching historical trajectory, but each book stands alone. Each narrator stands alone. Each perspective stands alone. So too says the Ramban, the second book of Shemot, just like Divrei Yamim, just like Ezra, should stand alone. All right, and therefore, and then skipping a little further, the Ramban quotes the Ibn Ezra. He quotes the approach of Rabbi Avraham Ibn Ezra, we mentioned before, who says really what we're dealing with here is a continuation, a vav of continuation. And of course, the Ramban rejects it. But Rabbi Avraham Amar, the Ibn Ezra says, Ki pa'avor shehizkir b'sof sefer Rishon, ki ra yosef levanam b'nei shloshim, hizkir gam achaber tama yumatim b'peru v'ruven enu nachon. The Ibn Ezra says what we're doing here is just continuing the last note, the final word of Genesis, or picking up where we left off. But he's wrong. Rashi katav afal pi shemanan b'chayim, chazar manan achar mitatan b'shmotam, lo'odiyah chibatam shanim shel kachochavim shemotzim b'mispar. Beautiful. And then finally, the Ramban quotes Rashi, who he obviously rejects. He doesn't even think he has to argue it. He can just quote Rashi offhand to reject him because he's so midrashic, so out there. Ramban says, finally, there's Rashi. And what's Rashi say? Why is it that the Jews are counted a second time, that the Jews are hearkened back to the earlier counting? Why is it ve'eleh Shemot? What's going on here? We have God emphasizing that he's so involved and so fastidious in counting and caring for the Jewish people that he's going to start off the second book of the Torah by counting them again. All this is an expression of God's love and fastidiousness and care for the Jewish people. That's Rashi's understanding, Rashi's approach. This doesn't indicate anything about whether it's connected to the first book or not, but rather what we have here is an independent little bubble, a vacuum, where God's going to repeat himself from before, enumerate his treasures, and list the Jewish people because of how much he cares about them, how much he values them. Just as an interesting side note, pretty interesting side note, when I first learned Sefer Shemot, actually when I first learned Sefer Shemot I was very little, but when I learned Sefer Shemot when I was in yeshiva in Gush, I learned with Professor Yoni Grossman. Thankfully, I was lucky to learn with Dr. Yoni Grossman, who's amazing. And he mentioned that, I'm blanking right now, I'll look at my notes exactly who, but some contemporary rabbi, one of the contemporary Israeli scholars pointed out that 4 times in the Torah, really 5 times in the Torah, 4 times explicitly and here, Rashi says God is doing something because of how much he loves the Jewish people, once per every book of the Torah. Now the other 4 times, it's because the word love or chiba or care actually appears. This time Rashi really stretches it. But nonetheless, what they're trying to, what's being pointed out, and perhaps I think what's going on with Rashi a little bit here, is that Rashi really does make a concerted effort that every book of the Torah should open up and close with a positive message about how much God loves the people and how much God and the Jewish people have a strong relationship. Because Rashi is really doing an educational message in addition to his commentary of making the Torah a handbook that one can read and in the middle of the French Inquisition be inspired to be a Jewish person. So all these commentary, given the context Rashi's living in, take on a little bit of a different meaning, a little bit of a different perspective. So it's interesting that Rashi thinks it's important that once per Torah, every book of the Torah has to have an expression of God's chiba, God's love and treasuring of the Jewish people. And the way we see it in Shemot is that God wastes his ink and opens up by repeating himself and listing the Jewish people again, listing the names of the Jewish nation one more time. We're not going to go into that too much right now. It's an interesting, a beautiful idea. But what we do see is that this debate between whether it's a continuation of Bereshit, a new book, what we should call it, what that expresses, it really rages on amongst the Meforshim, amongst the commentaries, amongst the rabbis, because the stakes really color how we'll view this story, what we'll view as the climax, the context we'll read it through, and the perspective we'll adopt. So having done that, a little bit of that work, having seen a little bit of that background, let's try and flesh out a little more what exactly is the perspective we're trying to adopt, what exactly is going on here. So I mentioned that Rashi and the Ramban and some of the other commentaries, when discussing our Parsha, when discussing our opening scene here, the 12 tribes, or not 12 really, the list of the 10 tribes who go down to Egypt, some of them point out that this list, the list of Jacob and his sons who descended to Egypt, was already mentioned in Bereshit. Some point that out to make the point that this must be a continuation. You only repeat yourself if you're self-referential, if you're continuing the previous work. Others we saw make the point, well, you repeated yourself all anew, it must be that this is the beginning of something new. Like the Ramban said, oh, we repeated ourselves because now it takes on a new meaning, because the descent to Egypt now is about Geula, it's about redemption, whereas before it was just about the familial narrative. But what we see is, regardless of which perspective you adopt here, whether you adopt the Ramban or the Ibn Ezra, whether you think it's a continuation or not, we have a repetition here that begs addressing, that needs to be answered. Why is the Torah repeating itself? When we look in source we look in source 5, at the end of Bereshit, the end of Genesis, we already had a list of the Jews who are going down to Egypt. We had a list of the 70 Jews going down to Egypt. Almost identical, very familiar. So we look in source 5, the Torah says as follows. We'll read the psukim together. Shemot b'nei Yisrael ben Mitzrayim, word for word, the same thing. These are the names of Jewish people who went to Egypt. Yaakov uvanav, Jacob and his sons, Bechor Yaakov Ruvain. The firstborn of Jacob was Ruvain. So just to compare off the bat, Shemot b'nei Yisrael ben Mitzrayim, same thing. These are the sons of Jacob who go to Egypt. 8 Yaakov, with Egypt, Ishu Veita Ba'u, each household descended, as opposed to what we have here in Genesis, is Yaakov uvanav, Jacob and his sons, Bechor Yaakov Ruvain. The firstborn of Jacob was Ruvain. So one difference to note, we'll get back to that. The introduction, the opening of these lists, of the way the Torah recounts the descent to Egypt, differs between Genesis and Exodus. In Bereshit, we have a description of Yaakov and his sons going down to Egypt, whereas in Exodus and Shemot, we have Yaakov with households. We have Jacob, Yaakov with Jacob, Ish uveto ba'u, man and his household descended. That's the first difference. Carrying on now in our repetition, in our first section of the names, the Torah continues in Bereshit. Now, instead of just having a list of the tribes, we don't just have Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, like we had over here. We don't just list all of them. But rather, we get a fleshed out count of the 70 individuals. We go tribe by tribe, person by person, and name their children and their grandchildren to flesh out all 70 of the Jewish people. So the children of Reuven are Hanoch and Phalu, etc., etc. Bnei Levi, the children of Levi. Bnei Yehuda, the children of Judah, skipping to verse 13. Bnei Yisachar, the children of Yisachar. Bnei Zvulun, fine. Now we get to source 5, to Pasuk 15, to verse Tetvav, verse 15. Eila bnei Leah, these are the children of Leah, Asher Yalda Yaakov, who are born to Jacob, Padan Aram, and Padan Aram. The 8 Dina Vito, and so to Dina, Kol nefesh banav v'bnotav 33. All of the descendants of Leah and Jacob are 33. Ubnei Gad, Sifyon v'Chagi. And now we go into the children of God. And from there, we skip now to verse 18, pasuk Yechet. Eila b'nei Zilpah, asher natan Lavan Leah bito. These are descendants of Zilpah, which Lavan gave to Leah, his daughter. V'teled et Eila leYaakov 16 nefesh. And this led to 16 more children to Yaakov. Now, source 19, Bnei Rachel, Eshe Yaakov, Yosef, and Binyamin, the children of Rachel, etc. And then from there we go, source 22, verse 22, Eila Bnei Rachel, Asher Yilad Yaakov. These are the children of Rachel, which were born to Jacob. So I want to ask off the bat, this goes without saying, there's a simple answer, and then there's a deeper answer. What is different between the recounting of the names that descended Egypt in Genesis and Borashia, what we just read here, and what's different from our story, our version, in the beginning of Shemot? Does anyone want to point out any differences between source 1 here, our 6 verses in the beginning of Shemot, and source number 5 over here, this section from Borashia 46, where we find out the names of those who descended to Egypt?
One is more individual and the other one is more tribal. And
Oh, excellent. Rachel is absolutely killing it. Can you please say more? What do you mean more individual? What do you mean more tribal?
I mean, the one in Genesis or in Bereshit was talking about the actual individuals coming down, naming them very specifically, not just by their individual names, but who they were descendants specifically of. Versus the one in Shemot was very much about the households, and it wasn't about Reuven or any of the sons as like individuals, but as their tribes already at that point.
Beautiful. Exactly.
Tribes, I guess.
Exactly. Rachel is pointing out that, and perhaps one simpler way to begin to note this is that one of the most striking differences is that the section in Bereshit is so much longer, because the section in Bereshit enumerates every single person in the family. It lists all 70 people. It's focused on each and every individual of the family. But the section we have in Shemot, the beginning of our Parsha, just lists the tribal leaders. It's only concerned with the tribes, and none of the individuals that make up the tribes, none of the individuals that make up the Shvatim. So that's a huge difference. But even beyond enumerating all the individuals, Rachel pointed out, just the very tone and the description of what's going on here is much more individualistic. It's much more familial. After every single tribe, we have the person being discussed, the tribe being discussed, situated by his mother, by his family. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, and these are the descendants of Leah. Now we move on. Binyamin and Yosef, and these are the descendants of Rachel. So the descendants of Bilhah, so-and-so the descendant of Zilpah. The imahot, the mothers and the handmaids, they get repeated over and over again, because in this longer, more detailed, more individualistic recounting of who went down to Egypt, it's essential to place everybody, to organize everybody, and to situate everybody by the family, by the mother, by their place in the family of Jacob. Now, all of this, of course, is in stark contrast to our Parsha, because like Rachel pointed out, it just has the tribal leaders. But in addition to that, not only does it not mention the families, the mothers, the tribal grandchildren, etc., but it mixes up the various mothers, the various tribes. It's not divided by Rachel and Leah, Bilhah and Zilpah. Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, fine, but then we have Issachar, Zvulun, and Binyamin. The Psukim go out of their way to group together children of various mothers, various parts of the Jewish tribal leadership, to show that we're not dividing across family lines, but rather what we're presenting here is one unified tribe. Binyamin is just as much part of the show as Reuven, who's just as much part of the show as Issachar. In other words, I think what's being described here, and part of why the difference is so important and so striking, long versus short, individual versus tribal, is because we're trying to reappropriate, reuse something familiar, but do it in a different way to set a different tone. Like the Ramban was saying, why are we repeating this? Because we want to drive and we want to establish that we're dealing with the descent to Egypt. We want to harken back to that period that already occurred in our story, but we want to go a totally different direction with it. We want to repeat it because now it's taking on a new meaning and a new light as the beginning of a new story, as the beginning of a story of Exodus, as the beginning of the Jewish period in exile. And I think the culmination, the peak, the outcome of the Jewish exile is ultimately going to be a story of nationhood. And that's what we see here as a transition from Sefer Bereshit, Genesis, which is all about family and familial drama and familial tension. And in that context, of course, it's essential. We have to know who's a child of Rachel, who's a child of Leah. We have to situate everybody by their family situation, where they stand in the family, who they have rivals with the family. So in Borashit, we get a detailed account of every member of the family, who's their father, who's their grandfather, who's their grandmother, and how are they all related. But by the time we get to Shemot, a couple pages later, when we're now in Exodus and we're about to start Sefer Geula, it's about to kick off not just part 2, but a new story about redemption, the formation of a nation, and the beginning of the Jewish people's rise to God's call. There, all we need is the nation. There, all we need is the tribal leaders. There, all we need is the unity of being the Bnei Israel. So therefore, we repeat the same phrase, the same list of names, but this time we keep it to just the names of the tribal leaders. This time we mix up the order, and this time we leave out all of the mothers, all of the matriarchs. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, for sure, Joel.
No, but actually in some liberal synagogues, what they do is, well, they do it for various reasons, but they actually mention when they do, they do the Avot and Imot, like I say, Shemon Esrei.
Yeah,
But
also mentioned
they
Bilhah
mention,
and Zilpah.
but they mention Bilhah and Zilpah.
For sure.
Where, again, they do it for 2 reasons. Unity of, like everyone is equal, and also they want to show there's different types of families and different, actually Bilhah and Zilpah, they want to put them on a higher plane.
Yeah, for sure. And reclaiming the fact that someone who has a lower social class, like a maid, can still be a role model in our religion, all very valuable goals. For sure. Jeff, I see you raising your hand.
Hi. There's. It seems to me there's a glaring omission in Shemot.
Yeah.
And those are the names of Ephraim and Manasseh.
Well, they didn't descend because they're there already.
I'm sorry?
Well, they didn't descend because they're there already. Do they appear in the Borashit account?
I don't think they do. It's interesting because the whole thesis of that the nation is being formed, they're part of that nation now.
That's a really good point. And they do appear, actually, if you look on the screen here, in Pasuk Chaf in verse 20. It does say, "Vayivalei Yosef b'Eretz Mitzrayim." Joseph had born to him in Egypt 2 more sons. Yeah. So that gets mentioned in Genesis, but interestingly is left out here. One could perhaps say, I don't want to read too much into it, but perhaps this feeds into part of the theme we were discussing last week, that there's a real tension here of Manasseh and Ephraim going to be part of the Jewish people. So we have Jacob mentioning, we have Borashit mentioning them, but when we get to Shemot and we get to the situation we find the Jewish people in 200 years later, they're interestingly absent from their accounting. Great point. There's a lot to think about there in terms of what that means for Yosef and Manasseh and Ephraim's relationship to the Jewish people. All right, anybody else? Any other comments before we go on? Any other questions? All right, great. So I think already we're starting to appreciate a little bit how this narratively boring, sort of like sparse opening to Shemot is actually really interesting and important, very fertile, because it's our transition from one book to the next. It's our key to what's about to come, to the stage that we're setting and everything that's about to go on from there. So I just want to emphasize that because I think that's one of the themes that we're going to try and draw out a little and try and discuss a little bit more today. That this, what we're doing here, what we're accomplishing here a little bit, is setting the stage for what's about to occur. So all this is the first section, Eila Shemot, and that brings us now to the next section, Paro's concern. We know that the Jewish people descend to Egypt. Then we find out that the Jewish people have become enslaved. Joseph is dead, and Paro is concerned of the Jewish people's thriving and success and decrees he's going to kill the firstborn Jewish males, etc., etc. But I want to draw attention to the first verse we have right after our little intro, right after our coda, you could call it. I'm not a musician. I know there's a lot of musicians and artists in the shawl, but whatever it's called when you hearken back to like a previously important part of the song, I think that's like a coda. So it's like a coda. We like hearken back to the book of Genesis, and then we go off and we start our new book. And how does our new book begin? What's the first pasuk after Ve'ela Shemot, after that section? Ubnei Yisrael paru v'yishrutzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu b'mod. The Jewish people were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly. V'kimalei ha'aretz otam. The land was full of them. So now, why is that an appropriate opening to our story? Why is that an important opening to our story? Just on a very practical level. In terms of important background information, narrative, why is this the appropriate opening? How does this set the stage for our story?
If the Paro kills out all the Jewish boys, who does he have as slaves?
Oh, so that's a good question. Paro's shooting himself in the foot a little bit that he's willing to kill all the Jewish males, even though he's now going to lose his workforce. That's a great point. But I think what that highlights And what really is being communicated in this pasuk is that what we're dealing with here is a real anxiety of numbers for the Jewish people. This is important because this explains the story that's about to occur. The only reason there's this extreme oppression and not just standard old world slavery is because the Jews are so successful at procreating, which, mind you, wasn't so easy in the old world. It's a really, really big deal to be able to procreate and keep your kids alive, that now the Egyptians are feeling nervous about the Jews and now have this tension that it's not enough just to enslave them. It's not enough just to use them for utilitarian purposes of building up our nation. We actually want to actively defeat them, hurt them, subject them. So from a practical narrative perspective, this is the key to understanding what's about to occur. We're not just focusing on self-interest, on selfish needs, but rather Egypt is being presented as the biblical archetype, as the first introductory tale, at least in Exodus and not in the Torah, of a bad guy, of the evil guys. We have Egypt who are afraid that we're too plentiful and they want to keep us down. I also think there's sort of a beautiful parallelism or structural poeticism being mentioned here, because we know what's one of the first chapters, first verses, first stories in the Torah, in the book of Borashit, God's command to Adam and Eve to pru urevu umalu ta'aretz v'kivshua, to be fruitful, multiply, fill the land, and conquer it. So just like in the beginning of Genesis, the first man and woman are commanded to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. In the beginning of Exodus, we find out the Jewish people have been fruitful and multiplied and fulfilled the earth and filled the earth. We have a hearkening back to both the promise given to the early patriarchs, but also the beginning of the first book of the Torah. And we have here a parallel to that the second book is going to also begin with Puruvu, also begin with fulfilling and multiplying, and I think also set the tone. And the reason why multiplication, why being increased is so important is not just some weird sense of family values, but rather that we're dealing with a national narrative, a national drive, the desire to become a people. That the reason why it's important the Jewish people are procreating is because they're becoming large enough to be considered a nation, to be taken seriously on a global stage, etc. So by emphasizing and opening with this theme of Puruvu, we're both hearkening back to God's long-term plan, long-term narrative, and long-term vision for the Jewish people, for all of humanity, etc. And we're also very specifically setting the stage for what's about to occur. But beyond that, I want to focus even more on this familiar phrase, this powerful pasuk here. We have Puruvu mentioned, but Puruvu's exploded. It's no longer Puruvu, it's no longer just multiplying like it was in Genesis. Now it's Puru v'yishritzu. Yirbu v'yatzmu. Everything's doubled. Every verb has a new verb now. They're exploding, they're so fertile. The ma'od, very, very much. Seems like a very strange phrase. Just first of all, off the bat, seems sort of like immature articulation or syntax to be like very, very much. Surprising to see the Torah say it. But even more than that, because it's such a strange syntax, such a strange grammar, it's extremely rare. In fact, it's so rare that there's only one other place in the Torah where this formulation is used, where it's referenced, and that is when God promises Abraham that he will have a special covenant, a special relationship with him. And there the Torah tells us in Borashit Yud Zayin, Genesis 17, V'Avram ben Tishim Shana v'Tesha Shanim, v'Yirah Hashem Avram v'Yomer Elav Ani El Shaddai Yetalech Lifnai v'Yeh Tamim. Abraham was 99 when God appeared before him and said, I am El Shaddai, walk before me and be perfect. V'etznav riti b'nei v'nech, and I will give my covenant between you and your children, v'arbeutcha b'ma'od ma'od, and I will multiply you many, many times. And Abraham falls in front of God, he speaks to him, he consents to do the Brit Milah, to do whatever God asks him, and God then tells him, and you shall, and I will go and I will expand you, I'll make you fertile, Puruvu, Hefreti, ma'od, very much. So again, we have explicitly Parei, Hefreti, and Revei, Arbeutcha being tied to ma'od, to this very interesting, unusual phrase, specifically in the context of God promising Abraham the covenant of nationhood, the covenant of the land of Israel, and more specifically, that this covenant will be passed down generation to generation. So this verse, hearkening to the Puruvu, to the multiplication, to the familial reproduction of the forefathers, and specifically referencing Abraham's promise of Ma'od Ma'od, sets the stage for what's about to occur now, which is the national formation and the fulfillment of Abraham's promise. We're going to see God's fulfillment of passing his promise, passing his blessing on to Abraham's children, just as he promises, I'll give my promise over to you and I'll make you very, very fruitful. So again, we see how these little turns of phrase, these little references in the Torah are not just referencing internally and not just referencing to themselves, but referencing earlier to Sefer Bereshit, and thereby setting the stage for what's about to occur for the rest of the book. I also just wanted to point out, goes without saying, of course, that but part of the perspective, part of the mode or methodology we've been adopting throughout reading the Torah is that of the generally believing theological perspective that all of the Torah is written by one person, one God, one could call it redacted, whatever it might be, but one greater power. And perhaps one of the strongest reference to this idea that the Torah is not a mishmash composite, but rather to some extent has some sort of overflowing logic or some sort of unit of logic that drives it forward, is that at every stage of the Torah, we have interreferential work that refers to other books of the Torah. So, for example, we'll have the phrase ma'od ma'od appear in Bereshit and have a very specific context there. And the reader of Genesis will see it and say, why does it say that? That doesn't do anything for furthering the story of Genesis. But what it does do is set up a peculiar turn of phrase that can then resonate later in Shemot. So that's just an important note that really makes a strong argument for the intentional intertextuality of certain parts of the Torah. That we can have a peculiarity that only makes sense somewhere else later on in a different book in a different section. So while we can have another share about the different theological questions that are associated with Bible and Torah study, just wanted to point out, this is a very beautiful example of inter-book textuality, of intertextuality coming to really mean nothing at first, seem peculiar in Bereshit, but have a lot of significance later on by the time we get to Shemot. Yeah, Joel.
Just out of curiosity, I know there's different attempts among Orthodox scholars to refute biblical criticism. Would they use this intertextuality to try and do that, or would they?
I'm not sure anybody ever thinks of intertextuality as inherently a refutation of biblical criticism, just because it's not. Intertextuality is never a claim of how the intertextuality got there in the first place.
Well,
So like,
they could be redactor. I mean,
exactly. So my point is not a historical argument against it, but more of just an argument of meaning. That when you accept this idea that there can be meaningful intertextuality that's not merely redaction, you now open yourself up to these like really interesting parallels of why is it that this phrase ma'od ma'od is all of a sudden appearing in Shemot?
Okay, so no one tries to do that then.
I haven't heard that. I actually know that Rabbi Menachem Leead, I don't know if you're familiar with him from Gush. He personally really likes this argument. One of the reasons he doesn't find it so fruitful to pursue like documentary type of studies is because it ignores all the intertextual evidence that exists. So contemporarily, people talk about it, but I don't know academically if that's like a real thing.
Okay.
But all of this just brings me to the last point I want to talk about, and this question of setting the stage, of setting up Shemot, and that is the next few psukim, Paro's decree. And this, I think, is extremely essential, because not only is it the first chapter and the first story of Shemot, but I also think Paro's decree is going to be used here in the Torah to really, in a very clever way, set the stage for what's about to occur, and communicate the message of what we're about to experience. So we have Paro's decree in source 8, 10 minutes. Okay, we have enough time to read inside. The Torah tells us, "V'yomer elamo Paro."
You got muted, Rabbi.
Sorry about that. Unmuted now. Perfect. Now we're nice and quiet. Thank you. Whoever muted everybody. So in source 8, "V'yomer elamo Paro says to his nation, Hinei am bnei Yisrael rav atzum mimenu." The Jewish nation is becoming so large, they're greater than us. So he says, they're multiplying, they're getting huge, they're overtaking us. Hava nitchak malo. Just want to point out this interesting word. Hava. Let us, I guess. It's some sort of statement, declaration. Hava nitchak malo. Behold, they all become smarter than us. Pen yerbev nitchak malo. Let us be smarter than them, rather. Let us deal shrewdly with them. Pen yerbev haya ki tekran mechamav nesaf gamo. So nenu v'necham banu v'alam in aretz. Lest they become so plentiful they can war with us. So instead, I'm going to put taskmasters to work them very hard. And they'll build cities to Paro, Pitom, and Ramses. Side note for those who heard or read my drasha last week, just something interesting to note. It's emphasized multiple times that the Jews now are living in cities and building cities. Whereas at the end of Genesis, they were living in farmland and all the Egyptians were moved to cities. Something interesting to think about what's being communicated there. But okay, fine. So the Jews now are building the cities of Pitom and Ramses. But it didn't work. They kept multiplying. So the Egyptians used even harder labor. And they made their lives bitter with hard work. Very interesting phrase, appears very rarely in the Torah. b'chomer leveinim, with mortar and bricks, b'chol avodah b'sadeh, all the word of the field, et kol avodatam asher avdu behem b'farach. All the work they had to do in the field and building, very, very difficult. So again, we have a story that explains a lot of what's about to occur. This is an important, necessary background information for Moshe being thrown in the river, escaping, ending up not being thrown in the river, escaping down the river, ending up being adopted, being perhaps a prince of Egypt, depending on how well you think the movie depicted what occurred, ending up saving the Jewish people. All that occurs because of this anxiety of the Jewish repopulation, because of this fear of Jewish militarism, and because of this decree of Paro. So on one level, we have a very simple explanation of why this is how we're opening up our book of Shemot, our second book. But there's also a fascinating parallel here to the opening of Genesis again. We mentioned before we have the parallel to the Eden scene, to the Pru Revu, to the multiplication that God tells Adam and Eve, Noah and Adam and Jacob all to do, to multiply and have children. So we have that parallel here. But there's one other parallel here. Does anyone know, we pointed out, there's a very few interesting phrase, couple of interesting phrases that appear here. Hava netzach malo. Hava is a very unique phrase. Where does it appear, Jeff? Jeff, you're muted. You muted yourself.
I think it's the Tower of Babel.
Perfect. It appears in the Tower of Babel where God says, Hava ne'reid, let us go down and deal with the nation. But more than that, there's one other phrase that appears here, and the only other place in the Torah is the Tower of Babel, B'chomer u'leveinim. Exactly, with bricks and mortar. So what we have here is two textual parallels between the story of the Tower of Babel and the story of Paro's decree. So let's look at the story of Babel, the Tower of Babel, and with that we'll get a sense of what's going on here and we'll conclude our shir. Genesis 11 tells us the whole world was one culture and one language. They all moved into this Bika, this valley in Shinar. And everybody said to each other, Hava, let us go. This phrase again, Nobana liveinim, let's go build bricks. V'nisrafa lisreifa, we'll burn them until they're hard. So we have the invention of chomer leveinim. Bricks and mortar are invented with the Tower of Babel. And what do they do with it? They say, Haba, let us all go coordinated together and let us build a giant structure. Just like the Jews, what are they doing? They're building these giant pyramids, just like the Tower of Babel. They have this coordinated teamwork event to build this giant structure. V'yomru hava nimna lanu ir. Again, we repeat it. Let us go build a city, umigdal, and a tower. V'rosho b'shamayim, its head will be in the sky. Nasa lanu shem, and we will make a name for ourselves. Interesting, this idea of nasa lanu shem being contrasted with the ve'ela Shemot b'nei Israel. We're going to make a name for ourselves by building this Tower of Babylon. Pen nafutz al pnei kol haaretz, lest we become scattered across the world. God saw what they were doing. And God said, if one people with one language will do this is how they're going to act, then nothing's out of their reach. They're unstoppable. Hava ner davanav lasham svatam. Now God says Hava. Clearly the Hava, that word, is key, is characteristic to the story. It's the turning point. I'm going to go down and I'm going to mix up their language. Asher lo yishma'u ish sfat re'ehu, that man will not understand one language or another. V'yafetz Hashem otam misham al pnei aretz, v'yachadlu livnot ha'ir. So God scatters them. So what do we have? We have a story in the beginning of Genesis, after our Puravu, after our be fruitful and multiply story, where we see that man has been fruitful, and the product is that the earth is now full, is now populated. Oh no, though, they're so fruitful and they're so populated that they've now created a coordinated effort, and they're challenging the authority of the land, God. So how do they challenge the authority? They go and team up together to build a tower. So what does God do? Hava ne'reid, he appears and goes down. God mixes them all up, and therefore they're no longer able to accomplish their goals of unifying and overthrowing God. So what do we see in the beginning of Exodus? Paro now, viewing himself as God, viewing himself as the new divinity, the new leader, says, oh no, the Jewish people are going to be too unified. They're going to come together. Hava, let us go and mix them up. Let us go and oppress them. Let us go and throw them into the river so they can't overthrow me. So we have again this parallel of the same scene, the same fear of overthrowing authority. And we have Paro now, though, subverting the previous parallel. Whereas in Bereshit and Genesis, God is king, God is the creator, and God is the driver of the whole story. All of a sudden, the Jewish people are reigned upon by Paro, by man. This story is a story of Paro thinking he's God, of Paro thinking he can rise to that role. So the subversion of what goes on in Migdal Babel, and what's going on with Paro thinking of himself as the divine leader, thinking of himself as needing to suppress the Jewish people, sets the stage for what's about to occur and how this book and this story is going to be going in a very different direction from the previous book of Bereshit. So just to conclude and to draw that out, in Hazinu, and I only know this because this is my bar mitzvah parsha, so don't think I'm such a Talmid Chacham, but in Hazinu, in the end of the Torah, Moshe recounts Jewish history through a beautiful poem, a very difficult poem. And in that recounting of history, Moshe has a very interesting turn of phrase. Moshe says, "V'hanchel elyon goyim," when the Most High gave the nations their portion, "V'hafrido b'nei Adam," when God separated man out into different groups, "Yatsev gvulot amim," he fixed the boundaries of nations, l'mispar b'nei Yisrael, all for the sake of the Jewish people. Ki chelek Hashem amo, Yaakov chevel nachlato. For the portion of God is his nation, and the Nachala, the inheritance of Jacob, and Jacob is his inheritance. So we have B'hanchel elyon goyim. God is dividing up land, dividing up the world, and he's giving people their inheritance. But the Nachala of God is Jacob. That's what it says. But what the verse really is telling us here is that when God divided the world into different cultures and countries and lands and nations, why did he do it? L'mispar b'nei Yisrael, for the sake of the Jewish people. What Moshe is doing in Hazinu is he's retelling the Torah and saying the whole story of humankind in the Torah was for the sake of the Jewish people. The story of the Tower of Babylon was for the Jewish people. It's all setting the stage for the Jewish people. Because we're not for God mixing up the nations, making distinct nations, making distinct cultures, the Jewish people can never exist, our nationhood can never exist, the role we play in the world can never exist. In other words, why is it that Genesis starts with the Tower of Babylon story? Because that sets the stage for what's about to occur. Why is it that Exodus starts with the subversion of the Tower of Babylon? Because that sets the stage for what's about to occur in Sefer Shemot. So we see that this first section, this first parak of Sefer Shemot, is a hearkening back to Bereshit, but a subversion or a retelling of a lot of the themes, a lot of the textual parallels, and a lot of the content of what's going on. This time to tell us and to prepare us for the story of Jewish nationhood, the story of the enslavement in Egypt, the Sefer HaGeula, as the Ramban puts it, that we're about to explore together. So thank you everybody for sharing. I hope that was helpful. We have a minute. I have a minute or two if anyone has any questions. I'm happy to stay. No one has to stay if they don't want to, but otherwise I'll see everybody next week. And hopefully now we'll be ready, we'll be primed to kick off our exploration of Sefer Shemot.
Looking forward to the journey.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. I'm looking forward to it.
Rabbi. Thank you.
Rabbi. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank